Author Laurie Kaye is this episode's guest. She is here to talk about her book, Confessions of a Rock and Roll Name Dropper, My Life Leading Up to John Lennon's Last Interview. Laurie, so great to have you on.
Thank you. So great to be here. And I should say that Confessions of a Rock and Roll Name Dropper, My Life Leading Up to John Lennon's Last Interview, is the story of my rock radio related early life and career wrapped around what tragically turned out to be John Lennon's last day on the planet, December 8th, 1980. Also, the day of his last interview, which I co conducted with my RKO Radio team. And I was unbelievably able to spend a major part of that day with him and Yoko at the Dakota, and I felt like I'd begun to make lifetime friends, which sadly, of course, that couldn't happen because John was shot and killed mere hours after our get-together. Sigh.
It's an amazing story, a tragic story, and one that's all in this book. Take us back to your early years. Tell us where you're from and how radio played a huge role in your life growing up. Your stepfather, also, he didn't make things easy for you, did he?
No, he didn't. I'm a SoCal gal. I was raised in LA. I live here again now. And like every other chapter in my book, Raised on Radio came from one of my very favorite pop, rock, or musical songs. I have 18 chapters in my book. They're all named after incredible songs that I love. My chapter, Raised on Radio, is exactly how my life was because I had a dysfunctional family, my mother, grandparents, and eventually a stepfather. And they just made my life so miserable that right off the bat, I requested a transistor radio and earplugs. And almost every moment of the day and night when I was with them, I had it plugged in and I listened to the radio, to the top stations, AM stations in LA, KRLA and KHJ. And that was really exciting because right off the bat, I got to hear everybody from Little Richard to Chuck Berry, and then eventually the Beach Boys, and then eventually the Beatles. So radio definitely played a huge part of my life from when I was a toddler all the way up.
Yeah, and obviously the Beatles, like you say, huge part of your life. You even talk about how you knew the German language versions, or you had the German language versions of I Want to Hold Your Hand and She Loves You. And they were the reason that you made German your foreign language of choice in junior high, high school, and college. I love that. When did you first hear the Beatles? What was your reaction when you first heard them?
Well, I first heard the Beatles in 63 and 64 and listened to songs Please Please Me and I Want to Hold Your Hand, and I just immediately fell in love with them. And then I got to see them on Ed Sullivan too. That was really exciting. Then I got to hear a couple German versions of their songs, Komm, gib mir deine Hand, which is I Want to Hold Your Hand, and Sie liebt dich, which is She Loves You. And they impressed me so much that I wanted to sing along and learn German to sing them. And I did as a kid. And then when I was in junior high and got to take a language class, I immediately enrolled in German and kept that going through high school and through college too. It was really cool and still is.
Take us back to January of 1973. That's when the LA-FM radio station KMET, DJ B. Mitchell Reed, and the prize he had handed you, a pair of tickets to the Rolling Stones, sent you down your career path, and eventually to that interview with John and Yoko.
It was really incredible winning tickets to the Rolling Stones Nicaragua benefit at the Fab Forum here in LA because I'd never seen the Rolling Stones live. So I was super excited, and it was going to be a really expensive show because they were earning money to pay for people who'd been hurt and killed in the earthquakes that had hit Nicaragua. And since Mick Jagger's wife was Nicaraguan, that made sense for him to play. And the guy who put the show together, Bill Graham, was an amazing concert promoter. And I won front row seats. And when I went to go pick them up at the KMET office, I thought I would just get the tickets and run out to the car where the guy who was going to be my date that night was. The amazing thing was they said, no, B. Mitchell Reed, otherwise known as the Beamer, wants you to come into his DJ booth and talk to him. And I said, wow, great. And I went in and he asked me my name and my age and some other questions. And I answered him and he said, Wow, Lori, with a voice and an attitude like yours, you should consider an on-air radio career. And I got so excited and I thought to myself, yes, I will. And I immediately did, and it did work out that way.
Was it instant for you? First time behind the radio? Did you feel like you were right at home? Did it take some time?
Well, what happened is I went to college and then eventually left that college, which was UC Santa Cruz, and ended up at UC Berkeley taking journalism classes, going to journalism school. And one of the professors there said to me after reading a news story that I'd written, Lori, why are you in this class? You already know how to write news. You should go out and get an internship, and then you'll no doubt get a job right away and you can quit school and go right to work. And I thought, wow. And I found out that KFRC AM, which was the top AM radio station in the country at the time and was in San Francisco, was looking for its very first intern, which was for their news department. And I immediately applied and was immediately hired. And went in, and right away they were so proud of me and the way I wrote and could report. And I had already started writing specials for them, and they were thrilled enough to offer me a job pretty soon after my internship ended. And I took it. I was the news editor at KFRC right away. And not only did I get that job right away, but they also hired me to write what turned out to be the longest Beatles special ever written for radio in the United States, which was RKO Presents the Beatles. And it was 14 hours long. I wrote it and co-produced it. And then after it was super popular here in the United States, it got syndicated to play all over the world. And we elongated it to 17 hours, and we got to change the name to the original title I'd come up with. I love coming up with titles. This one was The Beatles from Liverpool to Legend. And that was super successful too. So it worked out really well.
So that answers part of the question too, is what led to that interview with John and Yoko. By this time, you've got the experience, you've got the resume, you've got the credentials. So it's obvious that you were the one for the job. It's interesting reading about your childhood and your years in high school and college. It's all wrapped around that day in 1980 when you interviewed John and Yoko. Talk about that, because that was important. There were aspects of your life that you could relate to, and he with you. Some interesting coincidences with your life and his. So talk about the importance of that and making sure that the book kind of wraps around your history and leading up to that interview.
Well, we had some similarities, especially related to our family, because neither one of us had a father in our lives, hardly at all, a real father. And neither one of us was very much taken care of by our mother either. So that was something that made me think, wow, I'm like John in a lot of ways. And another thing that made me feel close to John was the fact that we mentioned that we both loved Bali. He loved going there for vacation and thought it was really cool and told all his friends how incredible it was. And I had gone there during college to live there to study Balinese dance. And I loved it there too. So that was another great thing we had in common.
And the wild stories in the book, one of them involves the Grateful Dead, how you became a fan of American Beauty. And the second one is a story of Jerry Garcia trying to talk to you. I think it was at a concert, and you had no idea who he was. But let's start with that first story. How did you become a fan of American Beauty?
Well, when I was living on Bali, I couldn't get any music. And it was really disappointing because the stores didn't have any CDs. And then I saw on the floor of the room I was staying in a CD, but it was Grateful Dead. And I thought, oh, I don't really want to listen to this. I'm not a fan of the Grateful Dead at all. But it was American Beauty. And I thought, well, I might as well because I don't have anything else to listen to it. And I listened to it and I was amazed. It was really cool. So that was exciting. And then a couple of years later, when I was at KFRC and Bill Graham, who had put together the Rolling Stones Nicaragua benefit concert, was a friend of so many people at the radio station, and he would come by and offer us all tickets, especially to bands that were playing in the venues that he had there, and especially bands like Grateful Dead. And I unfortunately had to say to him, no, thanks, Bill. I'm not interested. And he wasn't really happy about that at all. But he did offer me plenty of tickets to other bands. So I got to see everyone there, from the Kinks to Tom Petty to you name it. And what I was really excited about, because I was super into punk, was when Iggy Pop was going to play at the Bill Graham venue, the Old Waldorf, in 1977. So I went to see Iggy Pop with a date, and it was such a great show, and I was so thrilled to be seeing him perform. And this weird, old, creepy looking guy kept coming up to me and trying to flirt with me and trying to talk to me and bug me. And finally, I just told him to get lost, and I started insulting him. And my date looked at me and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm getting rid of this creepy guy. He's bugging me. He's ruining my show. I'm loving Iggy Pop." And my date said, "Don't you know who it is?" And I said, "No, and I don't want to." And he said, "Laurie, it's Jerry Garcia from the Grateful Dead." And I went, "Oh no." And I turned around to apologize because I felt terrible, but he was gone. So I never could. And I felt guilty ever since.
Oh my God. So your career in radio was KFRC in San Fran. Was that your first entry into the business? Because you talked about being an intern. Talk about the places, various places that you've worked.
Well, I was an intern, and then I was the news editor at KFRC and did a lot of interviews and wrote a lot of radio specials. But I couldn't go on the air there right away because it was the number one AM station. And the head of the station said to me, "What you need to do is go be on the air somewhere else first, and then we'll bring you back." So I immediately got an offer from WOW in Omaha, Nebraska, the top AM station in the Midwest. And I went there. It snowed right off the bat horribly. And since I was a SoCal gal raised in LA, I wasn't used to snow at all. And I wasn't having a good time. I did love being on the air, but thank God I only had to be there for slightly less than a month when I immediately got another offer from King AM in Seattle. So I ran off to Seattle, got that job, went on the air, and I loved it there. Even though it rained there all the time, I still had a great time, met great people, and saw so many incredible concerts there. Blondie, Ramones played at a small bar there. It was really cool. And I had a terrific time. And I would have stayed there for quite a while longer, except one day out of the blue, I got a call from Dave Sholin, the music director at KFRC, saying, "Laurie, would you like to come to London with me and our engineer and producer, Ron Hummel, because we've got an interview coming up with Paul and Linda McCartney and their latest lineup of Wings, which included Denny Lane, the late great Denny Lane."
Yep.
And I said, "Oh my God, yes." So I immediately quit my job at King in Seattle and ran back to San Francisco. We went off to London, which was my very first trip to England, and had an incredible interview with Paul and Linda and his latest Wings lineup, and talked about their most recent album, which was Back to the Egg. And it turned out to be the last Wings album also. And then I came back and went on the air at KFRC, and that was really exciting too.
Yeah, you interviewed McCartney, George Harrison, Grace Slick, Talking Heads, the Ramones, David Bowie, and Mick Jagger, whom you put on hold so that he could listen to your newscast before getting down to business. This is one of those great radio stories. He called you just as you were about to go on the air.
Yeah. Well, I should mention that my interview with George Harrison and the Beatles producer George Martin were solo interviews, and all the other interviews I did were as well. And it was really exciting when Mick Jagger was about to call me because I was writing the RKO radio show the top 100 of the 70s. And of course, Rolling Stones had songs on that. So Mick Jagger called, and unfortunately, he called right before I was about to go on the air doing a newscast. So I said to him, Mick, would you like me to call you back once my newscast is over, or you can call me back? And he said, No, I'll stay on the line. I'll listen to you. And that made me extremely nervous. But I've
Yeah.
been on the air. I did my newscast. And he came back on with me and said, Laurie, you were great. Great stories. Incredible voice. So it made me love Mick even more. And of course,
Yeah.
I told him about winning tickets to his Nicaragua benefit show. And he was thrilled about that. And he talked to me, and that was a wonderful interview.
What a
And
great story.
also, for that same special, I got to interview David Bowie, who was really exciting to have call me too, and got to tell him about the first time I saw him and all the times I'd seen him since. And he was wonderful to talk to. And he told me how great it was to write Fame with John Lennon and record it with him, and how fast it went and how wonderful it was. So that, in a way, prepared me for the eventual John Lennon interview.
Yeah, how did you get that assignment to interview John and Yoko, December 8th, 1980? How did that all come about?
Well, I co-interviewed John and Yoko with Dave Sholin from KFRC and RKO. Also, of course, our engineer producer Ron Hummel was there, and the Warner Brothers exec Bert Keane, who was a friend of Dave's and had basically offered him the only radio interview with John and Yoko about double fantasy. So that was exciting. And the reason I was asked to come along, not only because I was a newscaster and I'd done so many interviews and come up with so many questions and everything for all of the interviews I'd done, but I'd interviewed Paul McCartney, I'd interviewed George Harrison, I'd interviewed George Martin, and so many other musicians. And so that, of course, made me eligible. And Dave Sholin immediately asked me to come with them. And it was going to be about a month or so away. And I said, Yes, I'd love to. And I listened to Double Fantasy, which really impressed me. So I was super excited about being able to do the interview.
Author Laurie Kaye. She is the author of Confessions of a Rock and Roll Name Dropper, My Life Leading Up to John Lennon's Last Interview, which is available. Came out in 2023. Am I correct? I think. Was that the original?
Yes, it did. It
Yep.
came out on December 8th, 2023,
Hmm.
which was the 44th anniversary of John Lennon's assassination and his last interview with me and my team.
Yeah. So describe that moment for those of us who just wonder what it was like to actually be inside of John and Yoko's home. You walk in, there's a wall to wall white shag carpet. I mean, what are you seeing when you first walk into the room? What's that like for
Well, I
you?
should mention that first of all, we walked into their main office and their staff told us, oh, John and Yoko are at a photo shoot up in their apartment upstairs. So it's going to be a while, but the interview will be in Yoko and John's private office. And they took us into that. And that was the place with this amazing, huge white shag carpet. And we were told to take off our shoes to walk on it. And it was extremely comfortable. And one of my other favorite things in the room was this amazing long glass coffee table, which had metal legs and metal snakes climbing up the legs. And I sat on the love seat right in front of it. And all throughout the interview, I kept looking at those snakes thinking, am I really here? Yeah, I am. This is so great. And the cool thing was, is that when John finally got there, came in, he sat down right next to me on the love seat for hours. So that was really thrilling too. But Yoko came in first.
Right. Yeah.
Talk to her first.
Yeah. And there's a knock on the door and it's John. You immediately got John to laugh out loud. What did you say when you first meet him?
Well, he didn't actually knock. What he did was he opened the door and we saw a nose and round glasses sticking through the door. And I just felt funny and I lowered my voice and turned to him and said, Can't you see we're in the middle of an interview? And he started laughing and walked in. And that's when he sat down right next to me on the love seat, mere inches away. And I thought, oh my God, my dream of life has come true. And it did.
Did you get the feeling that John was back to writing and recording for good? He told you that he was back to enjoying it. Because this was the first time in what, 5 years that he had written and recorded new music?
Yes, and he was really happy to be working on music again with Yoko, not just writing songs and recording them together, but just enjoying them together with each other. And he had been talking at first about being a house husband and raising a son. And I immediately wanted to ask him, I said, John, I want to ask about you getting the urge to make music again. That was my emphasis. And John burst in with his super loud, funny, and affectionate reply saying, oh, it came all over me all of a sudden. Love, I don't know what came over me. And then everyone laughed while I reacted confidently to his endearing response. And I said, I know, it's like you were possessed. And he said, I was possessed by the rock and roll devil. And of course, I started laughing even harder. And he said, John said, was that the question? He asked politely. Did I interrupt you? And I said, no, you got it. And then what he said in just a minute afterwards was, just suddenly I had, like, if you'll pardon the expression, a diarrhea of creativity. So that's what writing music again was like for him and recording it. And that was amazing to hear and made us all laugh so much.
Amazing to hear, but then you think, man, all the music that he could have written in those years, right up until, who knows, today. We have Paul still writing and Ringo still doing his thing. It's heartbreaking at the same time. What time was your interview with him? Was this in the afternoon, the morning? What time did you do this?
Well, we got there about 11 a.m., and by the time the interview actually started, it was around noon.
Okay.
And it went on for hours. And then, even after the interview, we kept talking. We made plans to get together in a couple weeks when John and Yoko were going to be in San Francisco and then go out to Hawaii. And we all decided we would go out to eat at Yoko's favorite Japanese restaurant in San Francisco, which excited me incredibly, not just because I love sushi and sashimi, but because I was so excited to be able to talk to John about all the things we had in common and Yoko about relationships because I really needed help. I hadn't had any really lasting relationships. Of course, unfortunately, that wasn't able to happen because John was shot and killed mere hours after our interview ended.
Yeah, but you made a connection. And speaking of connection, the connection between John and Yoko, there's been much written about it and talked about how much of a connection they had. There was something really special there. What kind of vibes did you get being in the room with them together? Did you sense that connection between them?
Absolutely. And even Yoko told us right off the bat that their relationship was incredible and there was a spiritual bond between them that was bigger than the both of them. And John, of course, told us when he came in and started talking about meeting up with Yoko and gave us the description of their entire first meeting and first date and first time recording and making love. And he said the time that they had spent apart, the 18 months, that lost weekend he was in LA, was pretty much the worst time in his entire life. And he was so thrilled to be back together with her, not just to be her house husband, but to be the father of their son, Sean, who was 5 years old at the time. And it was thrilling because John was excited. Sean had been born on his birthday, October 9th. So he felt that he and Sean were twins. And that absolutely thrilled him.
And John really appreciated the questions that you asked. He made you feel validated with that. He really liked the questions. What kind of things did you ask him about, and how open was he with answering those questions?
Well, everything I asked him, from getting back into music and how he met up with Yoko, that sort of thing, he was so excited about. And he would say, Yes, exactly. Yes, love. That's it. And he just made me feel so validated and so complimented, and probably more so than anybody else I'd ever interviewed. So that was really thrilling. And that was yet another reason why I wanted to be friends with him for the rest of my life, and thought that that was definitely a major possibility, which
Hmm.
sadly, of course, couldn't happen.
You write, quote, while countless books and bios have been published since on the life and times of John Lennon, none of those authors spent that ill-fated day with John and Yoko, nor were any of them confronted later on and literally forced into a conversation like I was with the beyond creepy character who was about to become his assassin. You don't name John's assassin, and for good reason in this book, so no need to state his name here, but you did see him after the interview. That's as John and Yoko drive off. He's right there.
Well, what happened was is that while we were just ending our interview, Yoko got a call saying that the ride in their limo to the recording studio session that they had booked after our interview wasn't going to be able to take them. So she asked if we could. And the guys that I was with were going back to the airport that evening and flying back to the West Coast, but I was staying in New York to have dinner with a friend of mine. They said, "Yeah, sure, we'll take you to the recording studio." And so when we all went out, and John and Yoko ended up coming out, and just before they got in the limo with the guys, we all ended up hugging and saying, "Oh, goodbye, I'll see you in San Francisco." So excited. And they drove off. And this creepy guy who'd bugged me even before when I first walked out started bugging me again and following me, saying, "Did you talk to him? Did you get his autograph? What'd he say? What'd he say? What'd he say?" And he kept following me all the way down the block as I was walking to my friend's office to go out to dinner with him. And finally, I didn't know how to stop him, but I turned to him and started swearing and acted like I was going to smack him. He finally turned around and left. And I realized what I should have done, obviously, was gone to the Dakota security department and said, "Get rid of this guy. He's not somebody you want to have in front of the Dakota." And even if they didn't, maybe they would have been able to get a hold of the police and get rid of him. Or maybe they would have looked and seen that in the coat that he was wearing, he had a gun, which I wasn't able to tell that was in his pocket. So I felt guilty ever since.
John did see him before as well, right? That morning, I think he confronted him, or vice
Well, that
versa.
afternoon, when he was on his way to the studio with Yoko, he autographed a copy of Double Fantasy for him that our Warner Brothers exec, Bert Keane, had given the guy to shut him up. And John autographed it for him, but he didn't bother John. He just bothered us and then me afterwards. It was just horrible and led me to feel guilty ever since.
Talk about the moment you found out John had been shot.
Well, what happened was, and this is something I fully describe in my book, I kept walking after I got rid of the guy and went to my friend's office and told him about my incredible day with John and Yoko at the Dakota. And we went out to dinner. And when we were done, we went back to my friend's apartment. And as he was just about to open the door, he said, "You're going to hear the radio when I open the door because I leave it on in case somebody tries to break in. Then they'll turn around and go away and go somewhere else." So we opened the door. The music was on for about 1 second. And all of a sudden, a reporter came on and said, "John Lennon has been shot and he's in the hospital." And I immediately screamed and ran out to the middle of the street, grabbed a cab, and took it to the Roosevelt Hospital, which had a big glass front door. And I looked in the glass door, and there was Yoko sobbing hysterically, holding on to someone that I realized later was David Geffen. And she was crying. And I thought to myself, I better not go in and try and make her feel better because I will make her feel worse. She'll remember why she was in town to do the interview with us. And so instead, I just felt bad and I went next door to the phone booth and I called the RKO radio network in New York, and they said, "Oh, come down immediately," once I told them what was going on. So I went to the headquarters and I basically spent the entire night doing interviews with radio and TV and print reporters all about the interview we'd done. And then suddenly I got to turn on the TV there. And finally, the TV reporter said, unfortunately, John has been killed. He wasn't just shot. And I started crying, and they said, and the guy who confessed to it has been arrested. And they showed him, and I looked, and it was the guy who'd been bugging me. And I was crying even harder and screaming. And I realized, oh my God, it's all my fault. And I felt guilty ever since. And then I had to keep going with interviews. And then that next morning, I was told I needed to go on the Today Show, which was also really difficult for me.
Let's begin with Laurie Kaye. You saw John Lennon yesterday, and you talked about death, in a matter of speaking.
Well, he did bring it up. He mentioned that if he were to be left alone, if Yoko were to die before he wouldn't be able to cope with it. He wouldn't be able to survive. And he said that he hoped to God that he died before Yoko.
He also talked about
that must have been a blur.
It was really hard. I was not only upset and nervous, and I'd been crying, and I'd been up all night, so I looked like I was, barely awake. It's really hard for me to still watch the show, which actually a link to that show is on the website for my book, which is confessionsofArockandrollnamedropper.com. So anyone can see it. Although it's not as bad, to be honest, as I thought it was at the time, it still makes me really upset to have done that. And after the show, I flew back immediately to San Francisco and had the copy of the interview with John and Yoko with me. And immediately KFRC put me in a hotel room and said, start writing the radio special. And it was originally not supposed to be written or aired until Valentine's Day, because Double Fantasy was a love album, but now it had to air right away. So I wrote it right away, listened to the interview, and cried as I was writing it, and dedicated the show to Yoko, of course, finished writing it, and it was just really hard. It aired 6 days later, the same day that Yoko created a 10-minute silence for John's passing, which was Sunday after he was shot and killed on Monday, the 8th.
How were you able to get through that difficult time? And when did you start to think about telling your story through this book?
Well, I didn't want to work again at all in rock music or on radio, but I had already just said that I would, and I had to do a bunch of interviews with everyone from Neil Diamond to just so many more. And so Barry Manilow. And so I did, and I kept going, and I took another job with another company and went on the air there every week. And I kept going. And then I eventually left that job and started writing on the print magazines that I'd been interested in, which was Rock Magazine, and did incredible interviews, including more with Grace Slick and another with Little Richard, which was an incredible interview. And he talked about the Beatles and his situation in concert with them too. So that was really great. And then after that, I got an incredible job with Dick Clark, which was amazing. And I talk a lot about that in my book too, and how great Dick was to not just write his weekly radio show, but also he loved my writing so much that he asked me to ghostwrite his weekly nationally syndicated newspaper column. So I did that, which allowed me to do a lot more incredible interviews and go to a lot more concerts as Dick Clark and write the articles as though Dick had gone. So I did that, and that basically got me through what had been so tragic for me. But I was so busy working that I never was able to write my book for, about 40 years. And something that I realized while considering writing my memoir was, unless you've kept a daily diary and written down what goes on in your life every day of the year, which I never did, lifetime memories can be really hard to come back to, especially the older that you get, which I was getting a lot older. So it was really hard. And so I didn't write my book, even though people who found out about my experience with John Lennon on the last day of his life said, "When are you going to write about that?" And I never answered. But finally, I got to say now. And that happened when the pandemic hit, because thanks to COVID, my TV production gigs all came to a close. And suddenly I had time to write my book. And so even though it took me a long time to finish and edit and find a traditional publisher, because the last thing I ever wanted to do was self-publish, I did. And it, thank God, has been successful and people have been really caring about it.
From an emotional standpoint, was it difficult to write? And then after you were through, did it help to kind of get some closure?
Well, it was emotionally extremely hard, as well as all the podcasts I've ever been interviewed on, and radio shows, and TV shows, and documentaries. And I did so many of those, recently and over the years, and it's always been hard. And even though the book sort of helped my guilt, it didn't take it away at all. I'm still feeling guilty.
Well, I'm sure you've heard this a million times, but it's easy for any of us to blame ourselves after something like that happens, but there's no way you could have known. And my respect to you for writing the book and sharing your story with us. And it is out in paperback and Kindle. There's an audiobook version, right? You read the audiobook?
Absolutely. Okay. I self-recorded it, and it's really popular with people because not only, like in my book, do I write the quotes from all of the people that I interviewed, but I also got to include a lot of the original quotes in my audiobook. So you'll hear John Lennon, you'll hear Paul McCartney, you'll hear so many others. So that was exciting for me.
Fantastic. That's even added reason to get the audio version. Confessions of a Rock and Roll Name Dropper, my life leading up to John Lennon's last interview. Now, let's also talk about the website again. You mentioned, but let's get that out there again. And I'll also put a link in the show notes. So where can people find you online?
Confessions of a Rock and Roll Name Dropper.com. And they can go to that and not only find out all about my book and about me, my bio, and see great pictures like the one I took with John and Yoko and Paul and Linda. They can also get a hold of all the links to the podcasts I've done and a lot of the TV and radio shows and print reviews and interviews. And also there's a section on where to purchase the book, so they can look up and find out all about that and see upcoming events. For example, the upcoming event I have that I'm very excited about is I'm going to be part of the Fest for Beatles fans again this coming end of March, the 28th through the 30th, and it's taking place in New Jersey. So hopefully a lot of people will be there because I'll be discussing and signing and selling my book and talking to people a lot. And so that's really thrilling.
Laurie Kaye, thank you so much.
My pleasure. I hope you really liked my book.
I loved it.
Well, thank you. And I hope everybody, including you, who read and totally dig my book, will leave me a glowing complimentary 5-star online review via Amazon or Goodreads or Barnes and Noble or any of the other bookstores that they could have bought it at online. And it would just be really cool because that will help promote my book. So thank you very much in advance.
You can count on it from me.
Cool. Bye.